We were doing a lot more projecting down into Helmand province, and so we were almost guaranteed gunfights every time we went out. And so it had evolved from that first rotation, lots of longer vehicle-mounted patrols. You'd get in the occasional gunfight, but certainly not as kinetic, to the almost guaranteed every time you went out gunfighting. And the amount of just global sort of trauma coming through the forward surgical teams and getting picked up by the aeromedical evacuation assets and these sort of things that we're involved in was non-stop. So it was this day in, day out exposures.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we hear the second round of our Combat Story with Dan Pronk, a former Australian SAS officer and medical doctor who completed 4 tours to Afghanistan. In round 1, we covered Dan's first calling as a triathlete until he found himself in medical school and eventually SAS selection. We also touched on his first deployments. In round 2, we move into the more difficult deployments Dan faced when things started getting darker, as they so often do. We also discussed Dan's newly released book, Resilience Shield, which takes SAS resilience lessons and applies them to everyday life to help others thrive, much as Dan has. Dan went on to found a multi-million-dollar company, TACMED, and has written 2 other books, Arterial Tourniquets and Average 70-kilogram dickhead. Dan is the most unassuming doctor you'll ever find, and I hope you enjoyed this second-round interview down under as much as I did. Dan, thanks for taking time to share your story a second time, round 2 here with us.
Ryan, it's great to be back, mate. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And a lot has happened since it's only been a couple weeks, but a lot of things have taken place since we last met. So thought we'd catch people up. One is you were kind enough to send out your new book, The Resilience Shield, which we'll talk about here to kind of guide us through some of the events we're going to talk about. But also, you broke your arm, right? That's another event that took place. I know you were telling me offline, and I saw it on Instagram, but if you could just give people an idea of what went on and kind of the stuff that you're up to on your personal time and what leads to this.
Yeah, so was out skateboarding with my 8-year-old. He's a keen little skater, and was I was just telling you, Ryan, before we got on air, but was trying to teach him how to pump on a half pipe. He's a little bloke, and he couldn't quite get the momentum to get up the other side of the ramp. And so I dropped in and was really exaggerating the movement of the pump so that he could see it and hopefully replicate it. And in doing so, just stacked spectacularly and ploughed into the other side of the ramp and put a decent crack in my arm. I'm not sure how well that projects, but cracked a bone up into my elbow joint and am waiting on the scan results from my chest as well. I reckon I've done a couple of ribs. So, a cautionary tale there. If you're a middle-aged man, stay off the skateboards or take it easy.
I did like it on Instagram how you noted you had a broken arm, and then in parentheses you had like the medical term for your kinfolk who follow in the doctor footsteps to give them an idea of what's actually going on, and us laymen can just see it's a broken arm. So I was laughing at that. And then obviously a lot's going on since we last met, talking about Afghanistan. And since a lot of the stories that we're going to touch on are going to speak to your time in Afghanistan, I thought it would be appropriate for us to talk just for a minute about what you're thinking as we see kind of the pullout of Afghanistan by Western forces, in particular these evacuations that are taking place. What's on your mind as you see this?
Oh, look, it's tragic to watch what's occurring. There's no question. And I've gone back and forth on this. If I allow myself to dwell on it, I do feel that frustration and that sense of futility to a degree that I think a lot of veterans would feel watching what's happening. But overwhelmingly, it hasn't changed my sense of what I feel was my contribution to that effort while we were there. I think anyone who went, of course, Afghan veteran yourself, Ryan, and we all did the best we could at the time when we had an ability to influence change. And I do try and live by the philosophy of focusing my energy on the things that I can influence. And so as tough as it is, I accept now I'm well out of the military. I'm sitting here in Australia, and there's very little I can be doing to positively influence what's happening. So I try not to dwell on it and have negative emotional reaction to it. But yeah, of course, it's hugely disappointing to see a lot of the progress that had been made just undone in a spectacularly quick time.
And I got to say, I would imagine Resilience Shield is appropriate for this time for vets who are looking at this and dwelling on it.
Look, I hope so. I think COVID was really a catalyst, and we'll talk more about the book as we go along, I imagine, but COVID was a real catalyst to put Resilience Shield out there and to speed up the writing process and really formalise that model of resilience that I'd been working on with the other two authors for a little while. But we truly hope that it is relevant across the board and that there's some strategies in there that will just help veterans at the moment who might be struggling with the events in Afghanistan and with their own. We talk a lot about cognitive reappraisal, so looking back on memories and having a different emotional response to them. And I fear that there's going to be a lot of veterans who had a relatively positive experience in Afghanistan and felt they contributed, and now they're going to be cognitively reappraising and looking back and thinking negatively about their time there. And I urge veterans not to do that. I think it's really a profoundly negative thing to do. It's hard not to. But I mean, we talk to that in the book, and just if people are aware of that, then maybe that can help. And then there's a bunch of other strategies there that might just help during these sort of really challenging times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with that, we can use this as a bit of a springboard into our next discussion. So for those who listened to round one, kind of followed your path from childhood into the military, becoming a doctor, assessing, and finally being selected for SAS, and 2 of your 4 deployments. So now what we wanted to do was move to deployments 3 and 4. And actually, after having read Resilience Shield, you have great anecdotes from that, where you describe some of the difficult times and what's coming next. So I was hoping we could use maybe some of those anecdotes to describe what you went through in those next 2 deployments as we move through your story.
Yeah, sounds good.
So if you could put us back in time, you come out of deployment number 2, you're going to 3. What year are we looking at? And you're still with SAS, right? You're the doctor there running medics in the program. You're forward deployed with them. Where are we at? What year are we?
So that was the end of 2011. I came out of Afghanistan after my second rotation. And that was the one where the first rotation was kind of all fun, lots of near misses, no one seriously injured, couple of blokes shot, but no one killed, and false sense of security out of that one. Didn't lose anyone. Into the second one, as we discussed last time round, our task group started to suffer some killed in action, and I experienced that firsthand, and that was a real turning point. And so I came out of that rotation really quite wound up. To be honest, and you know how it is when you're in the field, and any veteran will know this. You constantly need to keep going. You can't. The show keeps going, so you keep operating, and we just kept doing mission after mission. And at the time, it was a great distraction. It meant that you could just sort of pack the events away in the back of your head somewhere, and you didn't have to stop and think about them. There was no processing required. You could just keep moving, and it was, in a way, a really good coping mechanism at the time to have that distraction and be occupied and have something to focus on that didn't allow you to dwell on the events. And when I got back from that rotation and had a little bit of leave when I got home and realised that I was really wound up, and a lot of us were, and it was at that point, and we had all the compulsory post-deployment psychological briefs and debriefs and sessions with the psychs, and started to. It was only at that point that I started to realise, hey, hang on a sec, maybe some of this is is starting to have an effect on me from a psychological perspective, and did a bit of work with the psychs then. And interestingly, that was a psych after that rotation who said, hey, have you thought about writing stuff down as a means of just processing what's gone on, getting it straight, getting it out of your head onto paper or into a computer? And I found that very cathartic. I sat down and over a period of months wrote in really vivid detail around some of these critical incidents where we lost blokes, and that ended up turning into a 130,000 word book over a period of years and years. I found that to be a very cathartic exercise. It never got published; they wouldn't let me. But I'm working on that again. We'll look at whether I can edit that to a publishable form. But in among all of that, I started to get back into the work routine, and so when we were home, we'd be on constant training rotations. We'd be doing the counter-terrorist capability and the offshore recovery. So it was, once again, you could go into the distraction and then it was ramp up and build up for the next tour. And a big part of me felt that getting back over there was going to be, well, I desperately wanted to. It was this strange, hard to explain to people who haven't been there. I can see you nodding your head, Ryan, you get it. But somehow I think with most military folk, you want to get back over, and part of me, I think, felt that I needed to get back there and get some closure of some sort. I don't know, but before I knew it, I was back in the work routine, had once again sort of pushed all those negative events into the back of my head. I might have naively thought that I'd dealt with them, and then it was just all about ramping back up and getting back over to do the job again.
Can I ask, when you came back and you talked about seeing the psych, you're a doctor today and at the time. Do you feel that you were more attuned to, first of all, maybe more willing to go see a psych compared to some of the other folks? I'm curious within that community if they were pretty open by 2011, kind of these assaulters going and talking to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But also, were you maybe more attuned to some of the symptoms or what was happening with you because of your medical background?
No. I was as naive and sort of bulletproof and insightless as everyone else, and maybe even more so, to be honest, because perhaps I thought because I had that training that I would be better at dealing with it. I don't know, but no, I wasn't. And to talk to the point of the unit as a whole, at that stage, the culture was predominantly one that didn't see the psychologists. We went to our compulsory psych debriefs. The psychs were sadly seen as the people who wanted to stop you from deploying or take your gun away from you. And so, I now any opportunity I get, I encourage people in that position to embrace the psychs. And I think the only reason they're tarred with that brush is that the only time they properly engage with people is when they're so far down the rabbit hole of mental health issues that the only safe thing to do is stop them from deploying. And so if they had have been seeing them and unloading some of this and processing some of the psychological baggage, they probably wouldn't get to that point. So I think we're viewing psychologists completely the wrong way. We should be viewing them as any other performance-enhancing member of the team, the physiotherapists that help you with your injuries or maintain you so you don't break. We need to be viewing psychologists in this same manner, and I'm embarrassed to say that even as a health professional, I was not doing that. I was going to my psych debriefs. I was lying to them like everyone else did, telling them that I'm fine so that they would sign me off to deploy again.
Gosh, it's so interesting.
I can see you've done the same thing, mate.
I would just love to be a fly on the wall for these psychs as soldiers are coming back and just the lies that they're told and what happens afterwards. There's nothing they can do.
Yeah.
I'm interviewing a guy, Mike Hayes, in a couple weeks, actually later this week, who's a former SEAL commander for 20 years. And he ended up taking over command of the SEAL team that came out of Operation Red Wing early in the war, where Extortion 17 went down. And obviously, he was not part of the unit. He was dropped in after that event and trying to bring people around to psychologists and psychiatrists and how hard that is. in that community of SEALs. And I'm sure similarly in SAS, there'd be some commonalities there.
I think there's, and I've thought, sorry to interrupt you, Ryan.
No, please.
I've thought a lot about this, particularly in the last 6 months, and looking at this whole processing of psychological trauma for the warrior culture. And I've just actually wrote an article the other day looking at using the find, fix and finish part of the intelligence targeting cycle as a kind of metaphor for how we can better deal with psychological trauma in this culture, trying to make it relevant to the culture. And
yeah, that's great.
And I'll throw that article out there in the sort of near future. But I think we need to be this suspicion of psychologists and specialists. I think we need to view them differently. And I think we all like to internally debrief, and you want to be debriefing with people who understand the culture, might have been involved in the same traumatic incident. And there's a great merit in that. There absolutely is. The problem with that, though, is you can fall into the trap of what they call co-rumination. You just go over and over the negatives and sort of reinforce those thought patterns and emotions, and that can be a real negative, but you get that bond with the people who were there, and that's a positive. So, if we use the teammates and workmates and people that get the culture to get that support, but don't lean on them for anything more and don't expect the tools to process it from them, the family and friends, they're going to know the individual on a personal level and might be able to have more vulnerable conversations with them, but they won't understand the culture and they won't get it in terms of that visceral ability to empathise because they weren't there. But they've got a role to play with that, knowing you as a person outside of work. And then there's the specialists who I think have been shunned from these communities because they don't get the culture, they weren't there when it happened, and they don't know the individual on an intimate level. So for that reason, they get shut out. But they've got the tools, they've got the training, and they've got the tools to be able to, if you're open to engaging with them and understand that they're not going to get you, they're not going to get it, but that's a good thing because they can be impartial, they can not have that emotional connection, but they can give you the actual evidence-based tools to help you process it. And so I'm sure that there's an individual sitting in the middle of this that needs to do the work. There's family that have something, and friends and people outside of work that have something to offer, and that's those vulnerable conversations away from the work environment where you can drop all the bravado and bullshit that you have to keep up in the workplace. And then in the workplace, you've got your teammates that get you and they get the culture and they really can viscerally sort of empathise with you, so you can lean on that. But then you've got to bring these specialists in because they've got the tools that can help work you through it.
You brought up something really interesting there about the family and how they could kind of detect what's going on. And for me, I had seen that like with the spouse could be a really early tripwire for picking up some of these symptoms, especially if you've been around each other for a long time. I was curious for you, at that time between deployments 2 and 3, did she pick up on stuff? Because you guys had been married previous to that deployment. Yeah,
no question. And in this sort of analogy that I'm using with find, fix, finish, I talk about the people like your friends and family being like the part of the intelligence community that have got sensors out there. They've got human out there in the field. They're watching pattern of life, and they will pick up. And I talk about the enemy being the psychological enemy in your brain, that you don't know is there. And it's just like when you're scanning a battle space. If you're not plugged in with your intelligence community, if you're not reading the intelligence briefs, if you're not listening to what your int crew's telling you, you're going to miss subtle cues of enemy presence. And this is exactly what you're saying, Ryan. And I think it's those around you who know you well will pick up those cues long before you consciously pick them up, and they'll be subconscious. They'll be the hypervigilance, those slightly anxious states that all of us, I think, in that warrior culture, just simple things like when you go to the pub or a restaurant, you're always going to pick a chair where you can see all the entrances and exits, and you don't want your back to people and all this, and that's if you don't pick up on the cue that's not normal behaviour. A normal person doesn't feel that they're going to be at threat in the pub, and it's all these subtle cues that are subconsciously happening that don't register to us, but they do to other people.
Yeah, that's so true. So let's fast forward then into that third deployment. Did you have much downtime in between 2 and 3?
Yeah, no, I think it was about 6 or 7 months from memory before I was back. And the third trip was so it's all a bit of a blur, but it was a bit of a shorter rotation, and then peeled out and only had a few months and went back for a full rotation. So it sort of events occurred that just dictated I went back a little bit out of sequence to when I was probably meant to. But yeah, so it wasn't a huge period of time.
And then if we just look at some of the more trying missions you found yourself on, could you just speak to some of those? And then I think we could layer on some of the resilience shield on top of this, anecdotally, as you describe some of these events.
Yeah, so by the time I went back for the third time, it was very, very much still hugely kinetic. There was a lot of the kill capture operations going on. We had a lot of aviation support, so it was rare for us to do vehicle mounted patrols. So the dynamic of the targeting had changed to air mobile operations, in and out very quickly. And so it was fairly high paced, and certainly the risk was we were doing a lot more projecting down into Helmand province, and so we were almost guaranteed gunfights every time we went out. And so it had evolved from that first rotation, lots of longer vehicle mounted patrols. You'd get in the occasional gunfight, but certainly not as kinetic, to the almost guaranteed every time you went out gunfighting. And the amount of just global sort of trauma coming through the forward surgical teams and getting picked up by the aeromedical evacuation assets and these sort of things that we're involved in was non-stop. So it was this day in, day out exposures, and it was around that time that I started to become aware that I was building up these exposures. I'd started to get a bit more insight. I'd seen everything that had happened on the second rotation, and the risk was really in the forefront of my mind. And I was certainly very keen to still get out on operations, but I was a little bit more discerning as to what I was doing, and I'd look at the planning, whereas in the past, if there was a job going and I could get on it, I'd be on it. Whereas that rotation, I'd look a bit harder and say, well, am I going to add value? Because I used to find myself a bit in overwatch positions with company headquarters, and I was really not that useful in those roles, to be honest. If I couldn't get to the point of injury, there was no sense me being there. And so I started to be a bit more discerning about the jobs that I put myself up for. I was far more proactive in the training of the task group. I started to see that even if I was on the ground, there was a couple of instances where we had blokes hit, and because of the tactical situation, I might be 100 metres away from them, but I couldn't get to them. And other operators were the first responders, or the medics would get to them and do a spectacular job. And so I started to see that probably my best utility was to maximise the medical training for the entirety of the task group rather than try and project myself forward. So I started to evolve my view of my role into being one that was better suited to enabling the operators and really optimising all of their medical management, and still getting out where I could. And if I could be the bloke on the ground, great, but making sure that everyone... So there was a bit of a focus shift from trying to get on every job to trying to train everyone I possibly could to the highest level so that they could respond, which they did spectacularly. So it sort of changed in that regard. That third rotation, we lost one guy. So I wasn't in the field for him. I was he got evacuated back to Tarankout there, and I was at the surgical facility where we couldn't resuscitate him. And so he was another mate of mine. And so that was sort of yet another hit that we took there. And so it just sort of rolled on like that.
I wanted to ask, in the book, you talk about the Suckmeter, right? So this kind of like green to red barometer almost of the suck. So I would say, number one, could you kind of describe what you mean when you talk about that?
Yeah.
And then number two, is there a particular mission that comes to mind that set that mark on the far red side of that meter.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Suckmeter I reckon I got that patch on my first tour, and it was just a little sort of comical patch that had a meter with red, orange and green, and the needle was firmly in the red, and down the bottom it said Suckmeter. And so I had this thing, it's sitting on the wall in my man cave, and I came to think about that later as a bit of a metaphor for post-traumatic growth. So basically, which is a construct where you actually become a better version of yourself because of trauma. It recalibrates you. And I sort of thought of this Suckmeter that most of us get along in our lives, and in a normal middle-class existence, most of the time you're floating along, and you might consider a bad day to be if you sprain your ankle, or if you ding your car, or if you get a parking ticket, or have a fight with your significant other. These are the things that can tend to tip us into the red in a normally calibrated Suckmeter. And then if you have one of these massive exposures, and the key event for me was that recalibrated my Suckmeter was, I spoke of it last time we talked, I'd responded to a blast, a big IED blast, and this was the first time that I'd responded to one of my mates in the field and couldn't save him. And so he had initiated this device and very, very badly injured, and we couldn't save him. And that was the thing that recalibrated my Suckmeter. So I'd gone from having this normal middle-class existence Suckmeter where if I got a speeding fine for a couple $100, that tipped me into the red. And then all of a sudden had this experience where I'm kneeling in the dirt in Afghanistan in the middle of a gunfight with one of my mates horrendously damaged by a IED blast. And you know, watched him die, basically. You know, I sort of couldn't save him. And so this, all of a sudden, that's me in the red. That's the red on my Suckmeter. And so from there, anything else is a pretty good day. Like, it takes a lot now. I'm sitting in the green. I'm maxed out in the green. Here I am back in Australia, you know, having this chat with you, sipping on some soda water, and my wife's in the background. And so it's all rosy, and things that used to bother me water off a duck's back, because I've had this post-traumatic growth. I've had this recalibration of what my idea of a very bad day is, and it's all about that gratitude and that appreciation.
Did you feel like so that calibrated your Suckmeter right into the red, that event? But then on the subsequent deployments, did you feel like you were hitting that red again, and that furthered you down this path of post-traumatic stress before you hit the growth side of it?
There was a lot that added to it, and a lot that I'm now very grateful for. And over that whole period of time, just the cumulative events, so the things that I was involved in, and then on top of that, the loss of other soldiers, you know, the helicopter crashes, the IED strikes, the vehicle incidents, and just this cumulative, just terrible events, and watching mates of mine, you know, not sort of lose legs, have these horrendous spinal injuries. One bloke was rendered quadriplegic in a vehicle incident, and so, you know, all of these things, having been in that environment and watching them happen, and the consequence, the huge consequence for these individuals and their families, you know, life altering. And then to have come through it fairly physically unscathed. And I'm just so grateful that, and I feel this almost obligation to, well, it is an obligation to live my best life and make the most of still being here in one piece, because these blokes don't have that same opportunity.
You talk a couple times in both this book and I think in your previous 70 kilogram dickhead book, about your almost like your frustration with senior leadership and how they utilized you at the time, and then kind of in hindsight, more of a, hey, they were probably doing whatever they could to project as much force as possible, you know, trying not to add too much support element. Do you think some of that frustration came from the way you were starting to unravel with post-traumatic stress, or just dealing with these environments? Like, can you talk through that a bit? Because it's rare that you see somebody, a doctor, in the front lines with folks. So I'm curious how that plays out.
You're absolutely right. I think with hindsight, the problem was not with the hierarchy. The problem was well and truly with me. And when I look back, this is where I can start to see some of that cumulative stress of the role and unprocessed trauma starting to bubble over. And I had one incident. I don't think I've ever sort of talked to it in a book or an article or even on a podcast, but it was a training mission in a little set of islands just north of Australia. We were doing this hostage recovery operation, and so it was just training, but I had put forward a med support plan, and it was theoretically going into an enemy compound series. There was 2 hostages that were in separate locations, and I'd put forward a med support plan that projected myself and a medic forward with this, because in the training scenario we were miles from anywhere. It was a high threat environment, and anyway, it got shut down, and they went with just a medic on one of the helicopters. As that medic was inserted with the lead team, he got shot. We were using simunition paint rounds. He got shot in the face, so notionally was killed, and then they had no medical capability. And it sort of played out that one of the hostages got well shot up, other people got shot, and so I was watching this happen from the sidelines, sort of super frustrated that my medical plan had been knocked back, and in the debrief for that whole activity, it kind of just got glossed over. And we're sitting in this hangar, and there's the CO of the unit, CO of a couple of units. There's a bunch of senior people from the intelligence services that were plugged in. There's the CO of the aviation regiment that supports special operations, and they kind of gloss over it. And I sort of put my hand up and said, "Nah, hang on a sec, let's back up." And I had this embarrassing, well, with hindsight, embarrassing. I just cooked off. I was furious that. And basically had a go at the troop commander and said, what was your med support, mate? And and just in this public forum, just had a go at this guy. It was very inappropriate, and he actually bailed me up afterwards, and we went on with it. But it was, with hindsight, that was me starting to get frustrated with the role. And what I was failing to realise, and actually had this explained to me by the executive officer of the unit later, and this clicked, was that it's not that they were ignoring what I was saying. They were taking that on board, but the commanding officer had to look at this overall mission profile and had very limited spots on the Black Hawks, which were the insertion platforms in this instance, and he needed to weigh up, do we put more fighting force on this to try and optimise our chance of mission success, or do we put the contingency of a doctor and a medic in case we have a casualty at the cost of 2 other operators? And I failed to realise that it wasn't that they weren't listening, it was that they needed to weigh up these more strategic objectives. And I was just taking it personally, and yeah, I think I was fried, but I did start to get frustrated at what I perceived to be the lack of utilising the medical assets. And every time we took a hit where we didn't have the medical asset that I felt we needed forward, I took that personally. And I was just wrong. I was just plain and simple wrong. They were considering what I was saying. It was just they needed to make that horribly tough decision to not take a dock and put another shooter to optimise the chance of operational success. But I was taking that personally.
I wonder if we look at how long you go through these deployments, when do you start to realize and accept that you're dealing with post-traumatic stress? Is it during those deployments, or is it several years after?
Yeah, it was after. It wasn't until I got out of the army. So I kind of thought that, and I knew there was a few chinks in the armour after that second tour, but I thought I'd processed that because I was having a few symptoms then, but then it went away, and then I was able to get on and go and do another couple of trips, and I wasn't having any of the symptoms for years. So, I mean, that was 2011, and they didn't really catch up with me until 2014 when I got out of the unit. And so I moved, we got out. So after the birth of our third son, I'd just gotten back from my final tour of Afghanistan a couple of weeks before he was born. The little guy comes along. My wife's been raising the other 2, so they were very young sort of 5 and 2 and then have another bub. And that was the point where we decided as a family, hey, we're done here. And there was in terms of my military service. And there was other factors that played in. I'd been holding off promotion because as soon as I got promoted, I was going to go to a desk job. So I'd held myself back from I hadn't done my promotional courses, and very deliberately, I sort of had actively retarded my military progression so that I could stay operational, and so I couldn't do it any longer. They were going to post me out of special operations into a sort of senior medical officer desk job type role. I didn't want to do that. So all roads led to discharge. And so after Bub 3 was born, I put in my discharge, finished out that year at SASR, and then in early 2014 discharged and moved back to my wife's hometown, which is where we live now in South Australia. And I'd sort of seen this as being this really, like this panacea. We'd looked forward to it. It had been a stressful time for particularly my wife, raising little kids while I was away constantly. All of this had been adding up, and we thought this will be great. We'll move back to wife's hometown. We'll have a bunch of support. I'll be home heaps. I'll get a civilian doctor job that'll pay more. And there was all these positives, but it ended up being a really kind of terrible time from a psychological perspective, because it was when everything sort of caught up with me, when I slowed down, when my pace of life slowed down. There was no distractions there. I was away from that support of that group that I'd had all these experiences with, my tribe, if you like. I'd been uncoupled from them and just couldn't even remotely fit back into normal society. And then everything caught up with me. Then I started to get the bad dreams, the flashbacks, the racing heart, sweaty palms, the hypervigilance, all of that caught up with me then.
Just curious, how long did it take for you to get treatment for that? Because one of the things that was going on in the States, at least, was how hard it was to get into the Veterans Affairs kind of medical system to be seen. What was it like in Australia?
The treatment was there. I didn't engage. So I went once to a veterans psych service. So I went and saw a psychologist, and I'm not sure if this was my perception of the interaction at the time or if it was what was actually happened. But when I came out of that session, I went in and just gave the kind of big picture overview of some of my experiences and what I was experiencing at that time. And what I wanted was tools. I wanted a way forward and through this to get back to, a good version of myself. And it seemed so geared towards diagnosing and, medicalising, branding this. We need to get you the emphasis was on getting me to a psychiatrist to get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. There was talk of pensions and there was talk of medications. And I'm like, no. This is not what I want. I want tools. I don't want a diagnosis. I don't want medications. I want some strategies here to just help me try and get back to a better place. And so I never went back after that. I didn't follow up with the appointments. And it was around that time that I started to, and I think some of that was, I guess, the stigma of a mental health diagnosis. I think that the main thing was I was convinced that PTSD was not the problem. There was certainly post-traumatic stress. I didn't feel that I had the disorder. It was a bit too early to stamp it with that, I thought. But I also thought that there was something else going on, the whole loss of identity, the loss of purpose, the being uncoupled from my tribe. So I needed to rebuild that, and I didn't think that they were... And as I said, that was just my interpretation of that event, but I didn't go back. The way I found my way through it was to look at this from a really scientific perspective. So the doctor in me said, right, let's delve into the literature. Let's have a look at what's going on here, and maybe I can build a roadmap myself back to a better version of me as a civilian. I'd done it and I'd kind of optimised myself as a soldier. Let's do it again as a civilian. And that was what led to me having a really deep dive into the resilience literature, and that was where I started my pathway towards what ended up as Resilience Shield, just looking at what is resilience, breaking it right down. Why were we all so resilient within the special operations environment where we had all this trauma, but you kept going back, lots of gunfighting, everything's going wrong, you're getting all these exposures, yet everyone seemed to sort of cruise through all that pretty well. And then almost universally, when people got out, they struggled. And I started to try and deconstruct what was happening there with a view to reconstructing it in the civilian world.
That's awesome. Okay, so you touched on something here that I was reading in the book and really resonated with me. You said, I always found that the times in my life when I'd accomplished my immediate goals and was yet to set new ones, those actually ended up being some of your unhappiest moments. And then you also referenced you never really allowed yourself to enjoy the occasional achievement along the way, which might have helped, right? So could you just talk a little bit about that and how it fits into the Resilience Shield? Because I think a lot of high performers will feel that.
Yeah, for sure. So we talk in the Resilience Shield and we have a look at what happiness is. It's because we don't define it well. And I think most of us attach happiness to goal attainment, or, we have this idea, if I could just get that car, I'd be happy, or if I could just get that girl, I'd be happy, or this promotion, or if I was earning this much money, I'd be happy. But it's false. It's not that's not what we know psychologically. That's not what makes people happy. It's the struggle. It's embracing the suck. It's the grind. That's what humans are geared to do to feel happy. And the goal attainment is just the end of that struggle. And it's important to set your goals and to have those goals to struggle towards and then grind away and feel like you're making progress and evolving. And if you get that goal, then fantastic. And you need to recognize that. And I think a lot of, like you said, Ryan, a lot of people who are driven in that direction will just keep moving the goalposts and keep moving the goalposts, and you never quite get there, and you never allow yourself to acknowledge an achievement, and you always just set a new one. And that is a good thing. It's good to have these goals, but you do need to punctuate that with acknowledging, hey, yeah, you know what? I did okay there, and celebrating this and allowing yourself to have those small wins. So it's this sort of mix of the two, and I've always found when I've had a goal and I've struggled towards it and maybe accomplished it, in those periods afterwards until I set myself a new goal, I feel a bit lost, and you get a bit comfortable, and there's no growth, there's no evolution, and I certainly had that when I got out of the military as well. I'd gone into a very comfortable life that was a little bit directionless, to be honest, and I think that was a big part of why I struggled for that period of time as well. I think it all compounded.
Is this connected to what you describe as creeping excellence within the unit there, within SAS? This idea, maybe could I ask you to describe it for us and what that meant within the unit, this creeping excellence?
Yeah, I think probably the best description of that we used to see in the selection courses, and I imagine that it happens universally. You end up with people who go through the selection process and then the reinforcement cycle and become an operator, and then when they're DSing on a selection course, there can be this tendency to assess candidates as against that benchmark of a trained operator and lose track of this. What you're actually assessing them for is a trainability and attributes and things that you can then put in at the start of the pipeline. And so there can be this, the benchmark can get set higher and higher and higher, and you can lose track of that. And we'd see it in the unit as well. And as I was talking about before with the medical capability, we had outstanding medical capability and we were very well utilised, but I was always seeing what we didn't have. I was like, man, well, CAG has got this, or bloody DevGrew's got that. Why can't we have this or do that? And so it was this. I'd lost lost sight of the fact that we were at an exceptional level, and we were very well funded, and we were very well utilised, but all I could see was what was missing. And I think it's the same with that capability, and that can lead to this huge frustration. And it is a matter of taking that step back and looking at where you're at. The other problem I think within high performance teams is you have no barometer, and I think this is the same with trauma, because you're in a little bubble, and everyone else is at that same level of either traumatic exposures or performance from a professional perspective. You then set the bell curve over that group. And so you'll have high performers, low performers within what is an elite organisation. And you can lose that perspective, and we'd see this happen. And I think, coming back to the trauma perspective, if everyone is being exposed to the same things, you normalise it. So that's your new normal. And it's that same thing, and it happens in the performance. Is that creeping excellence? You're always looking for that little bit more, or you can see a high performer within your group that you're striving to be, and you lose track of the fact that you're actually doing pretty well compared to the overall bell curve of society.
I wonder, with that being said, if you, knowing what you know now with the Resilience Shield and coming out of PTS and the growth aspect, if you dropped yourself back into like deployment number 2 or 3, how would you advise maybe that unit CO to approach these problems differently?
It's a really challenging question, that one, and I wonder myself. I've sort of thought hard on this, whether I had been presented with this information back in the day, whether I would have used it or whether I still would have paid it off, and whether this. I think the thing that has been missing, and I truly hope that I might, in some small part, and we might, through Resilience Shield, be able to make this relevant, but it's the relevance. It's the relevance of this information to that organisation, to the warrior culture. Like, how can you get through to these people that are 25 years old and they are bulletproof and they haven't yet realised that they're accumulating this trauma, and they, like all of us, are thinking, nah, that can't possibly happen to me. That happens to other people. And how do you get this information and front load it into them? And the big piece is the mental preparation, the mindfulness, and the training of the mind to be able to. We get a really good stress inoculation and a skill set training that enables operators to go in and function well in really complex environments. And it's the same in policing, it's the same in EMT, paramedics, it's the same, in emergency department, mental health, nursing. All of these people are trained well so that they can operate well in these environments. But all that does is allow them to get more and more traumatic exposures. And what we're not trained well in is processing that and managing that as we go along until it hits crisis point. And then the system is geared to wait for someone to break and then prop them back up again to a level of function to get them back in their role where they get re-traumatised. And, so I think, coming back to your question, it's what needs to happen. And I think so. I saw some of the US elements doing it quite well. Some of the Tier 1 crews over there doing it quite well in the late period of my time in special operations, and we were starting to try and build this high performance initiative in special operations as well. And the operators get it from a physical perspective, all the sort of functional fitness and even from a psychological perspective, from a high performance, the sports psychology piece. I think they get it. They can see that enhances performance, but the piece of the puzzle that's missing is that mindfulness, that ability to have insight into your, the cumulative trauma, to have insight into the fact that it is affecting you, and to acknowledge that, just like our bodies, we can actively train our minds, and the evidence is starting to grow that there's things like mindfulness meditation, we know beyond question, gives you better impulse control. It allows you to function better in high stress environments. It allows you to switch off some of your stress response functions when you need to wind down after an event, and we know it changes the way your brain fires over time. It changes the way your brain is actually configured. It reduces down some of your stress response regions like your amygdala, and all of these sort of positive things. It reduces your pain sensation, so you can increase your pain thresholds by doing mindfulness meditation. All this incredible stuff that translates into being a better operator. And we're getting some data out of particularly the US in law enforcement, looking at mindfulness meditation programs actually reducing inappropriate use of force and workplace accidents in police officers. And so, I mean, there's statistics now showing us this stuff makes you a better operator. And you know, I talk to these groups, and I bring up people like samurai back in the day, or Shaolin monks, these warrior cultures that are underpinned by mindfulness meditation. You know, and mindfulness does not necessarily mean passivity. You can still apply lethal force as a mindful person. The difference being you are doing it consciously and in metered, calculated doses. You're not letting your reptilian brain take over and just spray bullets everywhere and sort of have an inappropriate force response. And then you have the tools to be able to start processing some of what that means on a psychological level. So, yeah, the mindfulness is a superpower. What needs to happen is this needs to be made relevant to the warrior culture and embraced as another form of optimizing human performance, just like all the physical stuff, all the skill set training. This is another aspect of human performance. So that's what the COs need to be doing, is trying to make this relevant to their culture and making it part of the training. Sorry, I'm banging on a lot here, Ryan, but
this is great.
There's a great example. I reckon it was McChrystal. I get my McChrystals and McCravens mixed up, but I reckon McChrystal was the boss of the 75th Rangers. If I'm butchering this, I apologise to anyone listening. But
I think that's right. McRaven was a Navy anyway, so yeah, it would probably be McChrystal. Yeah.
Yeah, of course he was. Yeah, so this was McChrystal, and this relates to tactical medicine, and this was in the early days of the Tactical Combat Casualty Care movement, the TCCC movement, and when McChrystal was the head of that 75th Ranger Regiment, he mandated tactical medicine to be one of their high priorities in training. Everyone got trained. They developed the Ranger First Responder course, and everyone got that. And then what we saw when they started to engage in both Iraq and Afghanistan, their preventable death statistics plummeted. But it was a command decision to prioritise tactical medicine, which wasn't really on the cards, that led to this overwhelming improvement. Everyone else saw that and thought, holy shit, there's something in this. Let's look at what the Rangers are doing, start doing it. Everyone started using arterial tourniquets and learning how to do TCCC. And now it's what we know. You know, it's everyone knows it saves lives, and everyone has a tourniquet, knows how to use it. We need to, I think, do the same with this mindfulness piece. It needs to be implemented and an influential commander needs to sort of drive it to their organisation. And I suspect the same will happen that we saw in preventable deaths, is that if that could be implemented, we'd start to see a significant reduction in the post-traumatic stress and you know, maybe even veteran suicide rates and all these sort of things.
Well said. I think professional sports, you see it all the time. These elite athletes are using these techniques to get better, to just get, shave seconds or milliseconds off of what they do. And it works. I interviewed another guy, John McCaskill, who's a former SEAL, and his whole thing since he's gotten out is all mindfulness. And I think it's pretty powerful when a SEAL or, somebody like that is able to talk about it and do it every day and host these sessions with people. It says a lot about that.
It is huge. And it seems that at this point, and myself included, my brother and Tim, the other two co-authors of The Resilient Shield, we've all come to it late. And I reached the point of starting a mindfulness meditation practice in those years after I discharged from the Army, simply because everything else wasn't working. All my maladaptive coping strategies, you can pour alcohol on traumatic stress all day long, and it will blunt it. It's a temporary fix, and it's a coping mechanism, but it's a maladaptive one. It doesn't get you any closer to building strategies to deal with it or processing what's happened. And within a week or two of starting mindfulness meditation, and I was super skeptical, like most of us in the sort of warrior culture are. But it was like this, holy shit, this is incredible, and I've never looked back. It is a superpower.
How often do you do it, Dan? Are you daily doing mindfulness?
Yeah, most days. And it's not for hours and hours. I'm talking about like a 10, 15 minute session most days. Some days I'll sit down and do 30 minutes, maybe even an hour, but that's rare. I'm certainly not sitting there burning incense and humming for hours a day. These are 10, 15 minute sessions a day, and the literature tells us, we know through brain scans of people that meditate and don't, and trials that have been done looking at this, that level of intervention makes a significant difference to the way your brain fires, and over time the way your brain's wired. So you don't need hours and hours. This is minutes, most days a week.
Yeah. And you brought up Ben, your brother, and Tim, obviously the other co-authors. Ben is, just quite a career, both SAS and then post military time, has been very successful. And there's no question tied to what I'm about to say, but I will say there was a section in the book where he talks about being special. And I think he's at an MBA program, and he has to do like a battery of personality tests. And he's like, they're just going to tell me how great I am again. I was special operations, and then I led the special operation. I was so special. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, you got some problems too. And trying to deal with that after 20 years of being told you're great, and how you have to cope with that. It was really interesting to see, I thought. But I wanted to ask, there are a couple other things that came to mind, both from this book and the last, and one of them I tabled at our last discussion. But that was when you bought your first kind of classic car. There's a great story tied to this. And I wonder if your wife has, like, that, this might be her calibration into the red part of the Suckmeter. But I was just hoping you could tell that story. I was listening to it as I was running, just on an audiobook, and I was laughing my ass off. So I would love to just hear it from you if you got time.
Yeah, of course. So I'm fanatical about cars, have been since I was a kid. My dad was a classic car enthusiast, and so we always had generally a broken down classic car sitting in the shed. And so I grew up trying to, help my old man work on these cars. And as soon as I started earning an income with the Army, first thing I bought was a classic car, actually off my dad, one of his old sports cars, a British thing called a Triumph Stag, and spent about 15 grand getting a big engine built up for it, and then just would blow this thing apart, just drive it like an absolute dickhead and blow it apart and rebuild it on credit, and wasted all my money for years and years on this car, and had a great time. Anyway, I've been from the earliest age fascinated by Italian cars. When I was a kid, it was all the little Lamborghinis and Ferraris and Lancias and Maseratis were all my matchbox cars, and always wanted the Lamborghini. Like a lot of kids of our sort of age and stage, had the Countach as the poster car, and so couldn't afford the Countach. But when I was just gotten into special operations, and starting to earn a little bit more money, and was just about to deploy for the first time, a Lamborghini, a thing called a Urraco, which was kind of the poor man's Lamborghini, an entry-level Lambo. It popped up at a used car lot not far from where I was living at the time, and I saw this thing, and I'm like, oh man, I've got to go have a look at it. And I remember backing out of the drive at the time, and I'd said to my wife, hey, I'm going to go check out this Lambo. She's like, don't buy it. I'm like, no, baby, no, I'm not going to buy it. I just want to go have a look at this thing. I've never seen one up close, and I'm backing out of the drive and looking back over my shoulder, and I hear this bang on the bonnet of the car. I wind my window down. It's my wife, and she says to me, "Don't you buy that fucking car." And so this is one of we were talking about our significant others having insight into what's going to happen long before we do. She knew before I did that I was going to buy that car, and so I pull up at the lot, and it's sitting there out the front. And the second I see it, I'm like, I've got to own that thing. And went in, talked to the bloke, took it for a test drive. It was well down on power. Like, it obviously, there was a reason why it was selling relatively cheaply. The engine clearly needed some work. And anyway, took it for a drive, couldn't afford it, but said I'll have it anyway. Maxed out my credit card to put a deposit on this thing so that he'd hold it. Had no idea how I was going to pay for this. We'd just bought an investment property and we'd maxed out all our credit to buy this house. So I had no access to any loan money. And coupled to which, I think maybe 2 days later, I was due on a counter-terrorist exercise. So I had to hop on this Navy ship and belt out somewhere. And so I'm driving home from this car lot, having put a deposit down and committed to buy this old Lambo that I knew had a pretty busted-ass engine. And I'm feeling sick in the guts. I am fucking panicked about telling my wife, and to the point where I phoned my parents, I phoned my own mum, and I was having this conversation. I'm like, what do I do? Like, how do I break this? I'm getting my parents' guidance. I phoned my brother, and I'm like, oh man, I've done something. Can you give me some guidance? And anyway, I didn't have the guts to tell her straight away. I reckon I told her about a day or two later. And I waited for other people to be in the house. We had friends around, and I broke it to her. I figured that she'd be less likely to cook off, and at least there'd be a witness to the murder if it. And then I had to nick off on this counter-terrorist exercise and say, I'm on the deck of this naval ship in the middle of bloody nowhere on a satellite phone trying to get finance for this car. So I'm ringing all these sort of dodgy finance providers, 20% interest type things, and cobble together this, enough finance to buy this thing. And so it ended up with this Lambo. I've still got it now, so all these years later. But that was the story there. It wasn't a smooth purchase. I'll throw another one in there. So when got this thing and was then deploying shortly after, and my wife and I went on this trip. We had one young son at the time, and my parents came and looked after him. We went on a trip out to this winery region in this vintage Lambo. So we're driving around, we're sipping wine. It's right before I'm deploying, and on the way back from that, the gearbox in the Lambo shits itself completely. Had to get the thing towed home. I nick off on deployment shortly after. It goes into the shop for a complete engine and gearbox rebuild, which pretty much cost almost the entirety of my deployment allowance. And so it was, it's just gone from there. It's been a great experience.
Does your wife ride in it today?
No, hates it. I've had that thing for 12 years. She's would have been in it maybe 4 or 5 times over that period. Hates the thing.
And just out of curiosity, in case, because as you have 3 boys, I have 3 boys, I'm sure one of them will do something like this. Like, what advice were you getting from your parents when you called them? Oh,
obviously Dad was all for it, because he's the one that instilled this genetic flaw in me that requires me to own these horribly expensive cars that break down all the time. So yeah, he's like, go for it, buy it, it's awesome. And I think Mum by that point was just defeated and accepted that this was a genetic trait. And my brother's no different. He drives a 66 Mustang that he's had since he was actually in officer training. He bought that when he was maybe 19, and he's, I think 45, 46 now. So he's had that thing all those years, and similar story. Cost him a bunch to keep it going, and it's very impractical, but loves it.
Just out of curiosity, if you could go hop in any car and go drive it, what would it be?
Ooh, I reckon the Koenigsegg, so that Swedish hypercar. I reckon that there's a fantastic story behind Koenigsegg, and maybe some people listening will know it, but this is this bloke that started his own car company. As a kid, he had this fantasy of building a car, and so went and started it and just ground away at it, against all odds, has built this amazing car company. I don't know if it still is, but at one point was the fastest car in the world. And, people pay $3 or $5 million for these Koenigsegg's. And yeah, I think if given my chance, either that or a Ferrari F40, I think that's one of these iconic cars that they reckon is a real driver's experience.
That's awesome. All right. So I just got a couple more questions from the book, and then I'll let you get out of here, Dan. But you mentioned it's kind of interesting, both mainly in the previous book, you talk about a lot of other authors, that you really liked, some quotes, even some podcasts, I think, but one in particular that I have not heard of before that I just it seemed to really resonate with you. And I'm curious, you mentioned How to Be Fucking Awesome by Dan Meredith. What is the meaning of this book to you, and where did that come from?
Yeah, look, I think with a lot of these books, and we get a bit of feedback, which is really humbling. I've had a bit, on average, 70 kilo dickhead, and we're getting a bit now on Resilience Shield, that I think the books that resonate with us, they resonate for a reason, and it comes back to that relevance, like I was talking about before, making things relevant to an audience, but also a time in your life when you come across this information. And I think a lot of the information packaged up in the stuff, certainly that I've written and that we've written together in Res Shield, is there's nothing terribly novel. It's just repackaged and reframed and hopefully made relevant to a new audience. And all those books that I mentioned just resonated with me at a particular time in my life, and they sort of hit on the right nerve and were delivered in the right. And I do like this new wave of self-help books like that. How to Be Fucking Awesome, the Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. This it appeals to me. It's packaged in a way, and there's a fantastic book called 10% Happier by a bloke called Dan Harris, and it's about mindfulness meditation. He's written another one that I think is called Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics or something fantastic like that. But it's another example of I came across that at a point where I was really getting into my mindfulness, and I listened to the 10% Happier on audiobook, and basically in essence that's how he describes what meditation has made him. It just makes you 10% happier. It's not the be all and end all, but it really helps enough. Doesn't change everything, but the way he talks about his experience getting into meditation is just hilarious. And on audio, it's in his own words. Oh, gee, it's brilliant. I couldn't recommend that high enough, particularly to people who might be listening to this thinking, oh, this whole meditation thing, not sold, Get yourself 10% happier. But yeah, that whole genre of edgy self-help really appeals to me.
Love it. I love it. Okay. And the other one that you mentioned that I've seen come up in several books now from guys who are operators. I don't know what it is, the commonality, but Kipling's poem, If. You kind of referenced it. I don't know how important it was to you, but enough that you put it in the book. Like, did that have any special meaning for you?
That was one that my dad was a big fan of and used to read to my brother and I as kids. And so it had that. And as a kid, you probably you can't get it. You don't have the life experience, but there's just so many. I mean, the whole poem is just so profound. And when you look at it as just the kind of mantra to live by, there's a few of them, and Kipling's If is right up there. That Man in the Arena by Roosevelt. Just stunningly good. And the other one is Desiderata by a guy called Max Ehrmann, and it's probably not as well known as the others. The reason I know it so well is we had it, a little framed version of it on the back of our dunny door as I was growing up. So, every day when I was taking a crap as a kid, I'd be reading this thing. And once again, it sort of, as a kid, you don't get it, but I knew it by heart because I'd see it. And I've got that very framed copy from my childhood now in my study. So I've still got that and it's still there. But yeah, those sort of, the parts of the Golden Journey to Samarkand, the We Are the Pilgrim's Master, we will go always a little further. I think there's some fantastic mantras in there that I've used over my lifetime, particularly training up for selection. I would run those over and over in my head on the selection course. In If, where he talks about if you can keep your head when all around you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, is something I have fallen back on a lot of times, particularly working in emergency departments when things are a bit scrambled, trying to use that as a mantra to just stay calm and be the sort of eye of the storm, if you like. And so, yeah, I think there's some fantastic. I've got a lot of little snippets of those motivational things spray painted, stenciled on my weightlifting platform, my Olympic lifting platform. So once again, when I'm there, they're written right in front of me, and when you're about to lift, you can G yourself up.
Yeah. I mentioned this on another podcast with somebody that I really wanted to name this in the arena after that, kind of after Roosevelt's speech or poem. It's so good, especially for people like you and the arenas you've been in.
Well,
just quickly, what is a dunny?
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
My brother,
go ahead.
My brother and Tim have got a podcast called The Unforgiving 60. And that's a reference from IF as well, where he talks about if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. And I think it finishes up with, then yours is the earth and all that's in it, and what's more, you'll be a man, my son. But yeah, that unforgiving 60 is a reference to Kipling there as well.
And I was just trying to get clarification on what a dunny is. It sounds like a bathroom.
Oh, sorry, toilet. Yeah. That's an Aussie thing. Yeah, apologies. Crapper, dunny,
no, I love it.
Toilet.
It works. Loo, whatever. Okay. So just two more things that I ask everybody. One is, was there anything that you carried with you into combat that carried sentimental value, a good luck charm, something like that?
Yeah, there was. And I'm not a religious guy at all, but, a couple of things. So there was a patch that was given to me by a medic, a special operations medic, really early in my time with special operations. And so the voodoo doll was the sort of insignia of Australian special operations medical. So voodoo medicine was the kind of name we traded under. And this medic had given me this voodoo doll patch pretty much in my first week at special operations. So I cherished that thing, and that sat on the centre of my body armour for every single mission I went on, and now is framed with a replica of my service rifle above the bar in the man cave. But before my first trip, I was given a St. Michael medallion that an Irish Catholic lady who used to run the medical centre at the base I was on, she had it blessed by one of the priests at her church. And she gave this thing to me before my first trip. And as I said, I'm not a religious guy, but when an Irish Catholic woman gives you something that's been blessed by a priest, then that was significant to me. And so this thing fit neatly under my voodoo patch on the front of my body armour, and that thing sat velcroed onto my body armour for every single mission I went on. And once again, it's now sitting in the man cave there, and I'll give that to one of my kids somewhere down the track when they're going out travelling the world. But yeah, so no idea if that did anything or not, but I wasn't going to take the chance and not have it on me.
That's awesome. Okay, and I know you gave me a tour of the man cave last time, so I'll have that up separately so people can see that. And I think you showed a couple of those amongst other things. And then just the last question I ask everybody, especially with the time that you spent in the military, the multiple deployments, like working on somebody you're really close to and losing them, all of that heartache and sacrifice, would you go back and do it all again?
Yeah, unquestionably. Which sounds really odd, and I think, people may not understand that, knowing what you're going to experience, why would you choose to do that? But for me now in my mid-40s, well, for one, if I were looking back thinking, gee, I wonder if I could have got into special operations and I hadn't tried, I think I would struggle to deal with that. We spoke last time about my miserable failure as a professional triathlete, and that's another thing where I look back and I think, well, you know what, I sucked at it, but gee, I tried. I gave it my best, and I will go to my grave knowing that I tried to do that and I failed, and that's no worries. I moved on to the next challenge, had a bit more success in the military and the medical side of things, but the person I am now is based on those experiences, and I think the gratitude that I have now is I couldn't have possibly had unless I had those negative experiences. And so I really do feel that It is, and post-traumatic growth is underpinned by trauma. You cannot grow, you cannot experience that growth unless you've had the trauma. So it's this is something I discuss with people as well. The trauma is almost like a gift, which sounds really odd, but it takes your blinkers off and it gives you a perspective that people who haven't experienced something terrible can't possibly have. And so, if you can reframe it that way and then try and package it into something that you can use as a positive, that's when you can really get that growth out of it. And a lot of that's, as an individual, is appreciation and making sure, that I am telling my kids I love them and I'm proud of them all the time, that I'm trying to be the best human being I can, the best husband, the best dad, the best doctor when I'm interacting with other patients. It's changed all of those things. I now see being a doctor in an ED where I'm working currently in an emergency room as a privilege, because I've got this role that is a secure job during COVID for one thing. Lots of people lost their jobs, but not only that, I get the privilege of being the person who can try and help someone when they're probably having their worst day. So I don't think, this is going to suck, it's going to be busy. I think, this is a real privilege. I've got a job, and I might be able to help these people's lives out, and that's the perspective I look at it now. And it's, I'm so much more optimistic. I'm so much more grateful. And with this whole Resilient Shield thing, it's hopefully we're packaging some of this stuff up into a relevant sort of book that might hit people like those other books I spoke about might be relevant to people at this particular time and might make a difference. And that's a real privilege. And I would have had none of that if I hadn't have gone through the military. So yes, to answer your question, long way around, Ryan, I'd do it all again, mate, in a heartbeat.
Love it. I really appreciate the time, Dan. You spent far longer than anybody should with me. Thanks very much for doing 2 rounds. And I hope one day we're in a place where we can grab a beer together. Oh,
I truly hope so as well. Beers on me, mate. Maybe the man cave if you get to Australia. I'd love to hope you here.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate the time.
Good on your own. Cheers, mate.
Thanks for listening to this combat story. As we wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you to those in the combat story community who have taken a few minutes out of your busy lives to not just listen to these stories, but also leave positive and supportive comments on Apple and YouTube. Here are some of the comments that caught my eye this week. Our first comment today comes from Sheila. Ryan, thank you for interviewing Vietnam veterans. They deserve our love, respect, and thanks. And this was for the interview with Hubert Yoshida, who, as many will recall, is a Marine Corps officer who fought in Vietnam and has a really unique story, including an amazing upbringing. But I couldn't agree with you more, Sheila. In fact, as I record this, my father-in-law is in town with us. He is a Vietnam veteran. He flew in Vietnam as a crew chief, working on little birds, or loaches, as they were called at the time. And we talk about this often. So thank you very much for sharing that. I couldn't agree with you more. This comment comes from Brian, who says, it's time for Ryan to go on Jocko's podcast. Brian, I really appreciate you saying that. Man, I would love to go on there. I think I'm a long way off from that, but I will say I would really appreciate having Jocko on Combat Story. I think it would be insightful, really interesting to hear how he was thinking about some of these different challenges we all know he's faced from his books and his own podcast, just to understand what it was like for him at that time, especially being an enlisted guy going into the officer side of the house and really understanding what that was like in the SEAL community. Thank you for leaving that remark, though, Brian. I appreciate it.